your work behind this. So excellencies, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have 350 people registered for the first session with UNCTAD of Business Beyond COVID, rebuilding SDG-lined business and investment. So welcome to this process. I'm Paul Clements Hunt. I'm from the Blended Capital Group, and I will be moderating the sessions today. And let me give you a little bit of context. So this process started in May of 2020. We've had conversations around the world for 8 months. And after this event, we will be presenting recommendations from the entrepreneurial, business, and legal and investment communities to UNCTAD for the World Investment Forum 2021, which will take place in December. And again, a footnote before we get into what will be lively discussions, I hope, is that this process started with the UN in South Africa, who looked at the very beginning of the COVID process, the COVID pandemic, to create a flash appeal. The Blended Capital Group were happy to work with the UN to move this forward. And out of that process itself, a really rich, robust discussion around the world, from Tokyo to San Francisco, with New Delhi and Sao Paulo and London and many, many cities in between. We've looked at how business and investment and the legal world can help rebuild better and bring business into both growth and development, particularly and notably for the poorer, less developed countries and communities of the world. So that is our agenda. And without further ado, I'm delighted to pass the mic to our opening presenter, who is the host. That's Dr. James Zahn, who is the Senior Director, Investment and Enterprise for UNCTAD, and very much the driving force behind the World Investment Forum. James, the floor is yours for 7 minutes.
Dr. Zahn, you are on mute, just in case.
Paul, I think James is having some technical issues connecting, so maybe, oh, there he is. Hi, James.
Hi, James. The floor is yours. I've just made an introduction. Hopefully you heard me. Dr. James Zahn from UNCTAD, who's our host, and will make the opening comments.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly. That's great. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Paul, for organizing this very important event. Distinguished participants, distinguished panelists, it is really a great pleasure to have you. On behalf of UNCTAD, I just wish to express our gratitude to your participation and your contribution to this very important event. And indeed, Paul and his group had made tremendous efforts, and this is a kind of accumulated effect, events that an effort through the past 8 months for this process, a key cross-cutting themes to work on the investment in sustainable development. Allow me just to highlight the recent trends and the challenges. I think the buzzword today is build back better. Then what does it mean for financing and investing SDGs? I think it's a kind of combination of short-term crisis response package with long-term sustainability endeavor to ensure inclusiveness and resilience. What is the current trends and prospects in investing SDGs? 6 years into the SDGs, the key challenge, what are the key challenges and opportunities? And we need to look into. Let me just try to highlight the gaps that we identified back in 2014 on the eve of adoption of SDGs. And at UNCTAD, we identified 10 sectors to group the 17 SDGs and estimated the annual investment gap of $2.5 trillion US dollars annually for developing countries. I think that number has been extensively quoted. But 6 years into the SDGs, and we did kind of review of the progress. In fact, it was evident that investment increased across 6 out of 10 SDG sector groups. That includes infrastructure, climate change mitigation, food and agriculture, health, telecommunication, ecosystem, and diversity. However, overall, the growth is far from enough to fill in the 2.5 trillion US dollars gap. So this was the assessment just before the pandemic. And the impact of the pandemic on the SDG investment was tremendous. And that we had a kind of assessment towards the end of last year. So the international private sector investment flows to developing economies in sectors that are relevant to the Sustainable Development Goals fell by about 1/3 in 2020. So this was because of the COVID-19, obviously. So except for renewable energy, investment activity fell sharply across SDG sectors in infrastructure industries that include utilities and telecoms. International project financing announcements were even down by 62% in value. And the greenfield project value across food and agriculture, water and sanitation, health and education were all down by 1/3 or 2/3. So that's quite challenging. And it's even more so for LDCs because decline is particularly concerned. The greenfield project announcement in SDG sectors fell by 31% in LDCs. So the project financing saw a major decline in infrastructure investment in LDCs and agriculture and food sector. So the pandemic has more than undone the progress made in the promoting SDG investment that was since 2015. So this is quite challenging. And the outlook for investment in SDGs is highly uncertain. The future developments will depend on the duration of the health crisis and also the effectiveness of policy response to mitigate economic impact. So here, I would say that it's just, in fact, this week, we have launched the Global Investment Trends Monitor. That is, we have been doing at the request of G20 and report of G20 periodically. And the most recent data shows that the global FDI fell by 42% last year. And this was kind of even below 30% below the trough after the global financial crisis in 2009. So the decline was concentrated in developed economies this time for 69% of decline, the lowest level in the past 25 years. But developing countries, even though it weathered the storm better compared with developed economies, still some regions suffered a lot from this decline. Latin America and Caribbean, for example, decreased by 37%. And even though for Africa, decline was 18%, but that was simply due to a few big ones, that big countries that weathered better. But out of 39 African countries, 28 recorded a negative growth. So this is quite challenging. And the main concern is for this year and the next. Looking at the greenfield investment announcement deals, the decline was 63% in Africa, 51% in Latin America and Caribbean, 38% in Asia. And international project finance also declined significantly. And these kind of investment types are crucial for productive capacity in infrastructure development and for sustainable recovery. Now, the key issue is that the lack of funds We all know it's not. And even sustainability themed funds is already reaching 1.5 trillion US dollars, but it's not reaching to developing countries in SDG sectors. So the reservoir is enlarging, but water are not really channeling to the fields that are bestly needed. That there are challenges for the policy level. We did kind of review of countries' SDG implementation strategies. That's over 100 countries. Overwhelming majority of the countries in their SDG strategies do not have investment promotion strategies built in it. And we look at over also 100 countries of laws and regulations, investment promotion strategies, and they do not have SDG as guidelines for promoting investment in this. So there's a challenge of double embedding SDGs into investment promotion strategies in the countries and embedding investment promotion mechanisms into SDG implementation. That's one. If you look at international investment treaty network, there's a 3,400 investment treaties governing cross-border investment. It was signed all before the SDG adoption. So this is predating the SDG agreements. Overwhelming majority of them do not even mention the word sustainable development. So there's a challenge for reform of the international investment regime, which is multi-layered and multifaceted. That's the challenge. More importantly, is institutional capacity building. That's the key. And if we see that countries do not have the capacity to prepare pipeline bankable projects that the risk return profile attractive for investors. And that is the big challenge we have. So we need kind of a partnership, private-public partnership. And we need a partnership even among the business community. Let's look at the investment chain. Upstream is growing pool of financing. I think Paul knows much better. Is growing all sorts of funds, and be it green bonds, be it social bonds, be it equity, sustainability dedicated. But then for FDI, it's shrinking, and we have the problem of downstream there, and we have the capacity problem. There's also a policy dilemma. All these SDG sectors are sectors less open to private sectors. That we can see from the existing our database of investment laws and regulations. Therefore, we need to address these challenges at the policy level and at the recipient level. That's my message. Thank you very much, Paul.
No, Dr. Zhang, thank you very much. I mean, thank you for your comments, which are both chilling and enlightening in terms of the impact and the ground we've got to catch up. I would throw in one piece of, I guess, good news if we can mobilize it. As you know, the UN-backed Principles for Responsible Investment, kicked off by the late and great former Secretary General Kofi Annan in 2006, are now backed by $100 trillion of funds which are committed to responsible investment. Our challenge is how to mobilize these deep pots of capital. James, again, thank you for your comments and for hosting. Our appreciation to UNCTAD for this initiative is very deep. And with that, let me pass across to the place where it all began and the individual where it all began at the beginning of the pandemic, and that is the Nordis Bekele Thomas, who is the resident coordinator for the United Nations in South Africa. So hopefully, Nordis, you're with us, and we can only thank you for a process that you started just after the pandemic began its dreadful journey across the world. So Nordis, the floor is yours for 7 minutes.
Thank you. I think, I'll just I wanted to put up my speech, but it's not coming up, so I don't want to waste my time. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for having me at this investment forum. Yes, it started with you, Paul, when we had the coronavirus, and in a country where there is no humanitarian activity, no structure for the humanitarian response, and therefore we had to start from scratch. And in a so-called high middle income country, where there is a country of two, one which is really high middle income, high middle income with 10% of the population, and the other one which is a least developed countries categorization level with 80% of the population. And the corona stroke, and we had this problem, and we had to come out with a flash appeal. And thanks to you and to your outfit for helping us to mobilize the private sector, we were able to have at least 230 activities for an amount of 23 million dollars undertaken to really help the government in meeting the challenges of the coronavirus. But as we were really implementing these activities, we were for sure confronted with one critical area, which is you can address humanitarian activities, you can address humanitarian needs through humanitarian response, but the need for socioeconomic development still stays. And unless you pay attention to that and you create or you build this nexus between the crisis and development, you are doomed to be within that sphere of humanitarian crisis for a longer time. So immediately thereafter, we started our recovery program, by coming out with our socioeconomic impact study. We showed the impact that the coronavirus has had on, the whole economy in the country, and with suggestions and programs that would help us in mitigating the impacts. And therefore we had our cooperation framework, which we tweaked in a way to make sure that this nexus exists and the recovery program begins. Luckily for us, the government was also thinking likewise, so they were working on together with us on district development model, understanding the fact that the inequality, unemployment is very, very dire in South Africa, and important and critical to be resolved as soon as possible. And that could only be done if you go to the districts which are completely deprived, marginalized, and impoverished. We did a quick study of the poverty mapping of these districts, and we identified those that are really least developed, and we went there together with the government. Now, what has, I am so glad that, the speaker before me, I caught him halfway, was talking about responsible investment strategies. We don't have that responsible investment strategies. Countries do not have them. And therefore, our aim and our objective is to go to the least impoverished, because they are really the people, they are the citizens of this whole community, and Corona has shown us several things. One is that you cannot progress unless the community is with you. Two is the fact that, there is no poverty, that attacks one and leaves, another part of the country. Poverty is the problem of the poor, but also it is the problem of the rich. And we have to really combat that together. And therefore we are going district by district into the district development, using the district development model, coming out with 2-3 things that we have in mind. The main thing is institution building. We need to build institutions in these communities. One is business solution centers. We need to make sure that there is a business solution center that will transform, all the issues, challenges, socioeconomic challenges into business opportunities. And they are certainly business opportunities, and they are viable business opportunities. And to do that, we need to really have a public-private partnership in building, a facility that would help us in identifying these responsible investments, a project facility. We used to have that with IFC when I was a private sector policy advisor long time ago. I don't want to say that, in the 80s. And we lost it. But
Nordus, we don't believe you. It was in the 1980s. Please continue.
So, we really truly need that. It was with IFC, World Bank, and UNDP. And what it does is really goes to the communities and comes out with viable programs. And it does the feasibility study so that, we have it ready, for investors that would be coming together with the community. So this is one thing that we would like to do. And the other thing is really, like I said, the Business Solutions Center would really help build the ecosystem around it, the support systems around it, so that we can have the forward and backward linkages, but also make sure that the supply chain and value chains are there. And the youth that is idle there is utilized. The women that are there are utilized also and become entrepreneurs. And we would also like to really put in place in the communities the third arm, which is the public service delivery arm, which would bring all public services to that community so that it's easier for investors, but it's easier also for communities to have their the services just there at their doorsteps. It's a one-stop shop that we would like to put in place. And these are the things that we would like to entertain within our cooperation framework. To do that, the UN cannot do it alone. The government cannot do it alone. But we would like really partners, private partners that would come to help us really transform all these natural resources that are there in the various areas into wealth, but using the energies of the community.
Nordus, thank you very much for those comments. Again, we're already moving to practicality in terms of ideas and rollout. Now, I'm the moderator for the day, and I'm about to pass over to the two convening Judge Professor Mervyn King and Professor Paul Watchman for their opening comments. But a little moment of housekeeping. Everyone knows we've got a crammed schedule. The good news is, in some ways it's bad news, we've lost a speaker from the session this morning. So I've just gained 7 minutes. So I'd like all our speakers to both be aware of the time, but also relaxed. Okay. So it's a game of chance, but we are right on time as it stands now. So Dr. Zan and Resident Coordinator Bekele Thomas, that's a wonderful start from the UN. I was a UN official from 2000 to 2012. It's sort of nice to be back near the family. That's all I'm saying. But without any further ado, let me pass over now to Judge Professor Mervyn King in South Africa, who's been a driving force around governance, responsible investment, accountability for many decades, and then on to Professor Watchman. So Judge Professor King, the floor is yours. You've driven this process. You've helped us anchor it with Professor Watchman. The floor is yours for 6 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and I hope you all can hear me clearly. Ocean Terma, the analytics firm, towards the beginning of this century, through the third industrial revolution of the computer age of the 70s, could expedite research into the makeup of the market capitalization of companies on the great stock exchanges of the world. And they analyzed iconic companies listed on the S&P 500. And it showed in the turn into the 21st century that only 20% of the makeup of the market cap of these great companies were reflected as additives in a balance sheet according to financial reporting standards, be they IASB under the IFRS or FASB standards, US GAAP. And it's interesting that Ocean Terma, as recently as towards the end of last year, did their final analysis, which showed it's now moved to 90% of the market cap of companies is not represented as additives in a balance sheet according to financial reporting standards. The ESG space has become more and more important. Because it became more and more important, the GRI, which started in 1997 to try and give guidelines to preparers of annual reports as to content, how to report on sustainability issues. And they looked at it through, they being the GRI, and I chaired the United Nations at the time on governance and oversight, and I became chairman of the GRI. So I speak with knowledge when I say GRI was founded to look at sustainability issues through a civil society lens. And it looked at sustainability as how it was impacting on sustainable development, as defined by Brundtland. In other words, how a company's activities and its product was impacting on the three critical dimensions for sustainable development, meaning not adversely impacting on the ability of those who come after us to continue to develop sustainably. Meanwhile, during the 20th century, entering the second decade of the 20th century, we had the formation of the IRC, which I was a founding member, became chairman, integrated reporting, connecting the financial with the so-called non-financial, because financial reporting had become incomprehensible to the majority of users, very complex, and sustainability reporting, there was a huge amount of information coming into companies through the net, and knowledge was being lost in information. Meanwhile, other framework providers entered the space. The result was for preparers, clutter and confusion. The result was for asset owners and asset managers, a dilution of comparability. And so we had standards developing such as SASB, CDSB, CDP, TCFD, excuse the alphabet soup, but I think you all know what I am referring to. But the most important of all those members of the alphabet soup is SDG. And the most important of SDGs is not one of the social outcomes. It's number 17, collaboration. We have seen this evidence during the pandemic. The collaboration by nations to obtain a vaccine, we've achieved that in 9 months, which usually took 5 to 10 years. Collaboration is essential to achieve those 16 social outcomes of the SDGs: clean water, clean cities, clean production, etc. What has happened in the reporting world, because reporting is the lifeblood of accountability, is that as recently as September last year, 5 of the main framework providers, IRC, CDSB, CDP, SASB, and GRI, joined and signed a statement of intent to collaborate and almost all to intention to harmonize those standards. The result was that I can say on an informed basis that we have to look at sustainability as a coin and no longer look at just one side of that coin. No longer look at how a company's activities, product, or service impacts on the 3 critical dimensions for sustainable development. But we need to look at the other side, how those 3 critical dimensions, economy, society, and the environment, impact on the company, the limited liability company, which is the most important citizen in all our countries, because it is the medium through which business is conducted, through which capital is raised, and also jobs are created. And economy, society, and environment does have an impact on how the company makes its money and how it produces its product. And the impact is on its balance sheet, the financial statements. It has an impact on financial condition. Secondly, it has an impact on operations, activities inside the company, its income statement and its cash flows, to reduce it to accounting terms. And thirdly, it has an impact on risk profile, its market capitalization. If, for example, service provider in its supply chain is found to be using child labor, it will adversely impact on the value of market capitalization and the cost of capital. So we have reached a fascinating stage where the IFRS has issued a consultation paper. The consultation closed on the 31st December, but I am reliably informed, so it's not within my knowledge, that the majority of responses to it is that the IFRS should expand its mandate to not only have financial oversight over the International Accounting Standards Board, but should increase its mandate to have oversight over an International Sustainability Standard Board. So you have harmonization of all these standards and guidelines in the ESG space, which would absolutely drive compatibility and make the lives of preparers, asset owners, asset managers much more informed, and enable the trustees of pension funds to make a much more informed decision as to whether to invest in company X or company Y. Some countries have already mandated that financial institutions or trustees of pension funds cannot invest beneficiaries' money in the equity of a company unless they've done an ESG audit on that company. In the capital markets of the world, a company issues a bond for bidding on a certain coupon. The financial institutions don't only do a financial due diligence anymore, they're doing an ESG due diligence. And if they don't, in my view, they're failing in their duty of care to their beneficiaries. In South Africa, for example, and I'll conclude with that, I see John Oliphant is on the line, our Financial Services Conduct Authority has issued guidance notice for all our financial institutions and our pension funds that they must do an ESG audit of a company before investing the beneficiaries' money in the equity of that company. So it's exciting because if that comes to pass, we have 144 countries with a common sustainability standard, which is hugely important to achieve a world where we hopefully can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals timelessly by 2030. But I think that the drive for collaboration, which has been achieved with vaccines, is going to carry on with all these other issues. And the content element of the ISSB is going to be focused on enterprise value creation, preservation, or erosion. And those of you who maybe read my book, Chief Value Officer, CFOs are no longer going to be known as Chief Financial Officers. They will be known as Chief Value Officers because it's value creation that is important. And the success of a company is no longer going to be its bottom line, no matter at what cost, subsidized by society and the environment. It's going to be what value has it added to society. Thank you, Paul. You're muted.
You think I'd be used to that by now. So Judge Professor King, wonderful, a message which will resonate across the world for our participants. And it's, again, it's about action. So as I pass to Professor Watchman, I want to frame part of the challenge for us from the opening speakers Dr. Zahn and the resident coordinator of the UN in South Africa, Nardis Bekele-Thomas. We've got a complexity where we go from the world's capital markets, the shiny towers of New York and London and Johannesburg and Tokyo, etc. So the capital markets, how do we link them to the last mile? And how do we play the intermediaries, the accountants, the lawyers, the investors, the asset owners, the managers in between? That's the complexity here. I will pass straight to Professor Watchman. Archana, you will be the first panel speaker in a few minutes after Professor Watchman. That's been a great start. It's practical. So Professor Watchman, again, another anchor of this process and a wonderful legal mind, the author of the Freshfields Report in 2005, which changed the investment game forever. The floor is yours for 6 to 7 minutes. Dr. Watchman.
Thank you, Paul. It's an unenviable task to have to follow Professor Mervyn King. It's a bit like the Rolling Stones going on first and the support band coming on second, but I will try my best to engage your attention. Last night, and I have to apologize for my appearance because last night was quite a restless night for me, and I don't usually get restless before making presentations. I've presented in the United Nations headquarters and I've shared platforms with some very impressive people like Al Gore. and I was unusually nervous last night. And because I was unusually nervous and couldn't get to sleep, I came across an old memory. Back in 1979, long before ESG, long before even environmental law or business and human rights, I became a young fledgling law lecturer, and I was about to give my first lecture in constitutional law. And I was very nervous, and I looked towards the Dean of the faculty, who was a very, very tall Scot with very impressive nose hairs. I remember him being tall and the nose hairs staying in my memory for years and years to come. I asked Ian Willock, who is my professor of jurisprudence, how do you lecture? What's the secret of lectures? And he said, there's only 4 golden rules, Paul. The first one is to start on time. That's a matter of courtesy and punctuality. Second, engage your audience. I said, what do you mean engage your audience? Well, say something, boy. Say something funny. Say something human. Say something that will shock them and perhaps educate them, and try and say all of these things, and they will love you for it. Thirdly, tell them what you're going to say it, and then say what you said and tell them what you said again. Finally, he said, the most important golden rule of lecturing is never overrun. Students will never forgive you for taking an extra 5 minutes. They will love you for taking 5 minutes less. I'm not going to take 5 minutes less, but I'm going to try and curtail my talk as much as possible. My wife is sitting behind me, and she tells me she's going to slap me in the back when I've got 1 minute left. I said, perhaps tap me in the shoulder. She said, no, very much slap you in the back. Okay, how do I engage you? How do I get your attention? I'm going to pose a question to you. It's a simple question, and Paul mentioned intermediaries. And I want to ask you the question, do lawyers have a moral compass? Or, as was said a few days ago to me, the update of that is, do lawyers have a sat-nav for sustainability? And I want to give you a case that is currently being decided by the United States Supreme Court. There are 1.5 million children working in cocoa plantations on the Ivory Coast and in Ghana. In December, some of those children, or people who had been child laborers, brought a case before the United Supreme Courts under their alien torts legislation. They argued that they should be allowed to sue chocolate companies who were complicit in human rights abuse and child slavery. That is a question before the courts. Now, the interesting thing about this case, from my point of view, is representing the chocolate companies who are arguing that because they're corporations, American corporations, and not individuals, they should not be sued in the American courts. Now, representing them is a leading Democrat, a leading human rights lawyer who has an impeccable CV in terms of prisoners' rights and other matters. One of the arguments he made, and this is the day after Holocaust Day, was that in support of corporations not being sued for human rights abuses, that the companies, the factories, owners and companies that produce lethal gas for exterminating prisoners in concentration camps were not prosecuted at Nuremberg. So I ask you the question, and I will come back to it, do lawyers have a moral compass? And I stress, I'm talking about corporate lawyers. And this is not a matter of defending liberty. This is a matter of profits and accountability. A few confessions. First, I am a lawyer, and I have been a corporate lawyer. I spent most of my life advising institutions, multinational companies, and banks, and bodies, NGOs, and bodies like the United Nations on the law. Hence Paul's reference to the Freshfields report. In the past, I also have to confess, I have used investment bankers. You see, there is a hierarchy of professions, and down at the bottom of that hierarchy in the public's mind is lawyers. But beneath lawyers are investment bankers. And from time to time, I've cast them away on desert islands to illustrate a point about the changes that have been made since 2020, so since 2000 rather. The importance of that is if we look back to COP6, which is 20 years ago in the Netherlands, then we look forward towards COP26 in Glasgow, we can see fairly major changes coming. I've just been slapped, so I have a minute. I wish to just emphasize the importance of intermediaries like lawyers and accountants and even firms of chartered surveyors on green buildings. These people can make a great difference. And one of the things that impressed me in the last year is that I was sent an article by my daughter, and the heading was ESG is hot. And I wondered what that meant. And it was about the recruitment of lawyers by law firms, that ESG was something that law firms were mentioning in the hope they got the right people to apply to them. And they see a major change. Now, the last thing I'm going to ask you to do is a bit of an exercise to keep your mind alive. One is I've just been tapped again. One is a quiz question. What do Professor Mervyn King and I have in common? And you can answer that offline later if you like, and politely, hopefully. And secondly, what I want you to do at some point during these proceedings is to put in your mobile phone the name of a law firm that you know of. Large, small, Australian, German, South African, whoever. Put in their name, and then when you get to their site, type in 3 initials, ESG, and see what comes up, because I think you'll find it quite interesting. That's the end of what I need to say for now.
Professor Watchman, you've anchored this process for nearly a year, and you just knocked the 4 challenges from your Scottish lecture out of the park. So thank you very much indeed. And again, moving forward, a little bit of housekeeping and then a bridge. For everybody who's joined us from around the world, the structure to this session is very simple. We've had our opening comments. We will have 2 panels. Each panel will have a respondent. So 2 panels, a respondent, and then we go to closing comments. So the agenda is rich and full. This is being recorded, and there will be a summary video sometime, we hope in March or April. But again, thank you for the opening comments. I would also say to everybody participating, it's great to have a discussion, brilliant speakers, but where does this go? Where this goes is off the back of our 8-month-long process. We've created something called the Waterberg Declaration. And that's a set of recommendations to the World Investment Forum. Now that document exists. It will go into a consultation period for 2 months after this event today. We will then formally launch it towards the end of March and offer it to the World Investment Forum. It will come from the world's companies, entrepreneurs, investors, anyone who wishes to back it. Last point before we go to our first panel, who've been very patient. Why Waterberg? Waterberg is a region within the Limpopo province of South Africa, and we began that process here. So we've called it the Waterberg Declaration of Business, Investor, Entrepreneurial Recommendations. But we hope it will resonate around the world in last mile communities everywhere. Waterberg is a beautiful, incredible spot, but it also has pockets of poverty. So again, I salute the resident coordinator in South Africa, because that Waterberg is one of the areas that they will focus their new district development model on. That's the Waterberg Declaration. Follow it when we launch it. I think you'll be excited. It is challenging and it is practical. It'll come after this event. So that's where this conversation will also end up. With that, panel 1, Archana Hingorani, who is the founder of Sienna Capital in New Delhi, I believe, or Bombay, I should know.
Mumbai.
Bombay. Good, Mumbai, I'm giving it away. So Archana, the floor is yours for 6 minutes. And just let me flag that Tara, you will be from SGS in Australia, SCS Economics and Planning, you will be on next, as our dear friend Kunt Kasemsit from the Thai Board of Trade has informed us that he has a clash and can't join us. That's where we've saved a bit of time. Archana, the floor is yours. Thank you to Dr. Zan, Nardis Bekele Thomas, Judge Mervyn King, Professor Watchman. Over to you, Archana, for panel one. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. So actually, I wanted to start with a story, a personal story about my introduction to the world of sustainability. It goes back to 2006 when we as a firm for the first time managed to create a large LP base and raise significant amounts of capital. And one of the asks from a large investor was that since they did not have the time to join UNEP FI, I would represent them at that table. And of course, I went in very reluctantly, only because A, I did not understand what that meant. B, I was from a country like India where the focus was more on employment and trying to get people on their feet rather than worrying about sustainability. And C, there were all these stalwarts from different parts of the world who would keep talking about, you know, we reduced emissions, we repurposed, and, you know, we saved millions of dollars, and I really had nothing to contribute. But in a way, actually, that's where I met Paul for the first time. And in a way, it was great because it allowed me to imbibe significant lessons on ESG early on in life. And it sort of became an important part of my thinking. And I will come back to this point, why it's important to ingrain people at an earlier stage in what they're doing, and then it becomes part of their DNA. And since I sat on that board for about 5 to 6 years, I brought all those learnings back to the investing premise on which we were sitting in India, and encouraged all my teams to make sure that we, just like Professor King or Dr. King mentioned, do an ESG audit before we go in. That didn't mean we did not need to do that transaction if it didn't fit all the parameters. It just allowed us to focus on those parameters and make that investment better, earn better returns, as well as create the right ESG or SDG goals, as we call them today. But what happened through that process was that we realized that as a firm, we actually were putting money into transactions that were having better returns. Because at the end of the day, all of this makes businesses more sustainable. And if you include your stakeholder groups in your growth and your progress, it just ends up being better valued. Now, a decade later, you know, it was funny because I went back to teaching. It was my original profession about 5 years back. And my first lecture, I decided to surmise all my learnings to the students over the last 25 years that I had from the investing world. And I conjectured on two things. I said, I see the future as being two parts. One, we are going to be floored by technology in our daily lives, as well as all industries. And second, ESG is going to become du jour. You have to think about it as if you would whenever you're doing an investment, as if you were looking at it. You know, you wouldn't invest in anything that was legally not tenable. You wouldn't invest in anything that was, you know, from a financial perspective, not fitting, right? You do those due diligences. So you may as well introduce this, because this not only is about governance, it's also about being able to provide a larger sustainable background for entrepreneurs. Let me cut to India. So, you know, India is actually a mixed bag, because while it may be a developing country, there are pockets that are significantly advanced, and then there are pockets that are almost aboriginal in their concept. And how do you deal with a country such as that and have proper sustainable development? And actually, I really like the way our government has focused on two things. They're saying, okay, looks like the world needs to have new innovations. Let's encourage new entrepreneurs. So we are willing to give capital, we are willing to give resources to those areas, but we want to make sure that that results in actually all the SDG goals: employment, gender parity, effective work, etc. It's very interesting to see that, you know, as a country, we have started to think like that. And oddly enough, and happenstance, it happens to be what I decided that I would do as a firm on when I branched out on my own with a bunch of partners, to see that we invest only in companies that have these two goals. A, they are doing new innovations, because I think there's no getting away from it. So in fact, one of the things that I find missing in the SDG story right now, although the word innovation does appear, it's not taken as seriously as, let's say, you were to say that you are saving water, or you're providing better livelihood. Those seem to be more important. But I think in today's context, if you don't add the innovation piece, even if you put that money to use for conservation or for better employment, I just think that it gets wasted at some point in time.
Archana, can I jump in and ask you a question? So, look, in the declaration I referred to, there's a key point, which is how do we, a recommendation, how do we connect capital markets to last mile entrepreneurs? There's another recommendation which flags the fintech, the digital, the artificial intelligence, the machine learning revolution, and how do we employ that in the same process, connecting capital markets to the last mile entrepreneurs and communities. And the investment world can be complicated, as you know, but asset managers and fund managers and intermediaries are the channel by which money flows. And to transform it and engage the last mile, that's one of the great challenges. But essentially, what you do creates jobs, creates livelihoods, if you're successful, builds businesses. And I think it's important to stress that. So the question is, can you see the connection between the capital markets, investment flows, and the last mile?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what we're doing. But I was just pointing out the impediments to getting to what you're talking about. And some of those impediments are, I mean, we've seen what's happened with the pandemic. In the Indian context, there's been a migration of labor, which nobody ever saw. It's like pre-independence when, people were flocking across the border lines and getting killed, etc. Many people died in this process. And people understood that migrant population is the backbone of economic activity in India. So obviously it's getting a new focus from everybody. But what I do see as the greatest, what's happened, if you look at the Indian context, what's happened like across the world, there's greater acceptability of driving the ESG agenda, let's say in public markets, right? But what are you driving? You're only driving the G part. It's so difficult to drive the E and S from listed company perspectives, because it's not necessary that they all are focused on that. But nonetheless, they get allocated from the public markets because they qualify under the G concept, right? So most of the public market investments are towards companies that have better governance standards. But that does not translate to actually completing the SDG goals that we all are talking about, and how do we get to them? And one of the biggest gaps is global funding. I mean, by nature, larger funds or larger pension houses do not want to invest in let's say $100 million fund. And by definition, most funds that are focused on ESG are smaller funds, right? So the lack of capital, I mean, not to sound like a lecture, but or internationally, everybody wants the developing countries to leapfrog to ESG today and not worry about their development as much as that, right? But in order to encourage that, there's not that much flow of capital. You have to really struggle to get that kind of capital, because you're stuck between two kinds of investors. Impact. The impact guy only wants to see the poorest of the poor get better. That's not a bad goal, but I'm saying that's all they want to see. And the commercially savvy guy is only interested in the IRR. You have to have something in between. That's what I'm talking about. And I hope I'm answering what you were trying to stress on.
Archana, thank you very much in that. Take another 30 seconds, 1 minute, then we'll move on to Tara. But again, it's that perspective. The image that resonates there is the labor, the informal laborers leaving the Indian cities, which we all held from the pandemic. And I guess that's been repeated around the world, but the Indian example was phenomenal. So Archana, actually, why don't we leave that there? Thank you for your initial input. Sure. And I'm going to jump across now to speaker from Australia, where I guess in some ways a different experience of the pandemic, but delighted to pass the mic across to Tara Callanan, who's a director at SGS Economic and Planning. Now, are you Melbourne or Sydney? And the floor is yours, Tara.
Thank you, Paul. I am calling from Melbourne here. I hope you can all hear me. And good morning to you. Firstly, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners in whose country I live and work, and that is the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and to acknowledge the traditional owners across the land we now call Australia, to recognise elders both past, present and emerging. I acknowledge that you, Australia's first people, have suffered the indignity of having your land taken from you without your consent, without a treaty and without compensation. I acknowledge that these matters are yet to be justly resolved. I would first as well like to offer my sincere condolences to anyone here today who has lost loved ones to COVID-19. I acknowledge that I'm speaking from a very fortunate position, as Paul has mentioned, here in Australia, having escaped much of the brunt of the pandemic this far. And I really, really hope that the end of a very long tunnel is near for everybody that is here today. So we have been asked here to discuss how globally we can accelerate the take-up of sustainable and economic social development based on the UN SDGs. And I would like to pick up on the word accelerate here, because that is precisely the opportunity that we have. We are experiencing at present a once in a lifetime event. We hope, I certainly hope, and I think everyone else hopes too. But really, COVID-19 has shone a light on many of the inequalities and injustices that have been enduringly present in our societies. And while devastating as an absolute health disaster, in the aftermath lies an opportunity to create a legacy through our investment choices that will last for generations. We can do this by accelerating the ideas that we already have to create sustainable places, communities, and economies. We have visions and plans and strategies that have already been set out, and they're more important than ever. So in Australia, we have big city plans. We have Plan Melbourne. We have the Greater Sydney City Region Plan. We have Living Adelaide, Brisbane Vision. We have Perth and Peel at 3.5 million. And these documents form important and shared foundations for decision-making about how cities should develop in response to global, national and local challenges. So COVID-19 pulls them into reflection just that little bit more. Importantly, many of these plans demonstrate their alignment with the UN SDGs, and they're doing that more and more. And we're seeing that with local governments and state governments continually in Australia. They all address some consistent themes, such as housing, open space, infrastructure, access to education, the planning of centres, transport accessibility, and importantly, climate change and the environment, and justices for Australia's first people. In Australia, as we've mentioned, due to the COVID-19 health crisis abating for now, we have seen some important work beginning to address these issues. So in November last year, in the state of Victoria where I live, Premier Daniel Andrews, he announced that the state government would spend over $5.5 billion over the next 4 years to build over 12,000 new social housing homes. And more than $1 billion of that is to be spent in regional Victoria, with funding also earmarked for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members. So that's the biggest single investment in social housing in our state's history, which is pretty incredible. And this announcement comes after many years of advocacy and work with the government from external policymakers such as SGS. And we see over the border that the state of New South Wales, their government in their COVID-19 recovery plan announced that they're committing $6.5 billion to deliver more than 190 new and upgraded schools across their state. So for investors, the message from Australian states and territories is quite clear. We want to stimulate our economies, but we want to achieve better outcomes for our communities while doing so. So clever investors, they've worked this out already, and right now they're inundating our governments with investment opportunities and partnership proposals. And while all of these opportunities should be considered, governments with clear plans and strategies are likely going to steer away from projects which are clearly against their strategic directions, and importantly, against those SDGs which they're measuring constantly too. It is clear that investment partners' purposes and agendas are also an ever-growing importance when partnering with government. We ourselves are a certified B Corporation, and we see this grow in its importance year on year. All Australian jurisdictions, they use a similar set of criteria to assess the merits of each investment opportunity that's put forwards, which often feeds into a business case process. And these questions are, the first one is whether the project contributes to the government objectives and priorities, whether there's a clear unmet need that the project aims to address, the likely whole of cost to government, the likely scale of net benefits after considering those social, economic and environmental impacts, and whether the project can be implemented in a manner that's effectively mitigates against those delivery risks that we see so often. Being able to articulate these elements to all levels of government in Australia, so that's national, state and local, will make it clearer as to why a project will help those governments create more sustainable places, communities and economies. And that's also working towards those SDGs. And I guess that's where I see the word accelerate being so important again. We have known for years what to do and why. We've written it down, we've gathered the evidence, and we have planned for this future. Maybe not the future we're seeing now, but one of them that we have looked for. And so now is the time to do it.
Tara, brilliant, thank you. Let me just throw in one quick question for a brief reply from you. Australia,
Sure.
Australia is, I mean, such an engine in the context of the Asia Pacific region. You have unbelievable linkages to Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. You locked your borders down early and effectively in the pandemic. Very briefly, in terms of that Australian re-engagement and the Australian investment flow externally, how do you see that happening and when?
That's a big question. And I'm not...
come back to it. We can come back to it.
Yeah, I think because I guess we're in an opportunistic age. The other question that you posed to us was about the digital age, and when we're connecting with all different types of industry around the world at the moment. I'm working with the defense industry at the moment in one of my projects, and they're all talking about the fact that business is so much easier because of the online environment. So in a way,
I'll take that as your answer.
Okay, sure.
Easier. We can reconnect.
No worries.
And look, I don't want to seem like a time whipper. We're okay, but I'm going to move us along. Also for the participants, you know, we've got a crammed agenda. If we can take questions, we will, but time is limited. But what we are committing to is any questions you submit in writing post-event, we will attach them to our speakers and prompt an answer. So that's our offer. Now let's move on. And Tara, thank you very much for those comments. The Australian perspective after India. And we're now moving on to, I guess, a global perspective in some ways. It's Martin Rich, who's the co-founder of Future Fit Foundation, a UK-based charity, who's doing fantastic work, which Martin's now going to describe briefly. For the sake of full disclosure, I do chair the board of trustees of the Future Fit Foundation, so I think it's appropriate to say that. Martin, the floor is yours, and then we go to Ingo Kumak, our respondent in Australia, who will give a reflection on what he's heard for panel one. Martin Rich, thank you, Tara. Martin Rich, I'm envious of your sunshine, by the way, out of the window. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, if only that was the actual view out of my window. Good morning from the UK to you all. Lovely to see some long-standing friends and so many new folks. I'm actually married to an Australian from New South Wales, so I'm very used to playing second fiddle to impressive ladies from Australia. So I feel like I'm in my usual place here. So Tara, thank you for teeing up the next part of the conversation. Although I do note that despite Professor Watchman's promise that he was going to lay into lawyers, not bankers, he still couldn't resist a dig. And hopefully I can persuade a few of you today that ex-investment bankers can be okay. Most of us weren't trying to destroy the world. Some of us are now perhaps trying to rebuild it a little bit.
So Martin, you have 4 minutes to save the reputation of the investment banking world.
There we go. There we go. So I want to pick up actually where Dr. Zan started us, talking about Build Back Better and the funding gap for the SDGs. And folks have naturally talked a lot already about the pandemic. And of course, what the pandemic has shown us really is two main things. Firstly, the social and environmental degradation and issues that we are facing that have caused this pandemic are becoming ever stronger, are causing more and more likelihood of these types of pandemics coming at us more severely and more frequently in the future. The exact origins of COVID-19 are still being debated by those who are far more knowledgeable in this space than I. But we know that the pushing together of society into the environment, reducing the space for wildlife to exist, creating spaces where the poor are forced to live in such conditions that they can't escape, that we end up with these situations where these types of zoonotic diseases can possibly begin to transact across into humanity. This is simply untenable and is going to get worse and worse and worse as we go forward. The second thing that this has shown us, therefore, is that carrying on with business as usual is simply impossible. If we just carry on trying to do business as usual and try and do the SDGs on the side, try and carry on doing what we were doing with slightly less smoke coming out of the chimneys, then we are just going to carry on along this same pathway. We might extend the runway a little bit more, but all we're going to end up doing is pushing the trouble 5 or 10 years down the line. We're still heading off the end of some horrific cliffs. Akana pointed out in her talk about the small size of ESG funding really available. So how do we start to shift that capital around the world that could be put into these businesses that need to radically change the way they are going about their business? How do we develop a world, a socioeconomic system that is truly responsible, regenerative, and because of that is resilient? What does that actually look like? This is what Future Fit Foundation was set up to try and answer. And what we've created is a strategic management tool, if you like, to show businesses how to actually get onto the right side of that line. Professor King referred to the two sides of the coin. We kind of have a similar two sides where we look at break even. Everybody knows what financial break even means for business, and for a business to flourish, clearly it needs to be on the right side of that. The problem is we've been trading on the wrong side of the extra financial, the environmental and social break-even point for so long. We've been degrading the planet. We've been degrading society. Again, I thought Tara's opening comments and respect for the original Aboriginal peoples of Australia reflect that trading at social social loss that we've been doing for so long. What does it mean to get back to break even and indeed beyond break even, to be regenerative in the way that we do business? What we're about doing is creating and showing that roadmap for companies to understand all of the harm socially and environmentally they're creating, to measure that versus this break-even point where they're no longer damaging planetary and societal boundary conditions.
Martin, let me ask you a question, right?
Please.
Because I mean, I absolutely get it. The Future Fit methodology and philosophy and the things that you do, clearly it can apply to a big listed business, or it can apply to the Mittelstand in Germany.
Yes.
Or, and my question is, can it apply to the last mile entrepreneurs who are starved of capital and finance in the frontier economies? And have you got a plug and play to fit these different business needs? So across that business boundary. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but
it's as if you'd read the last paragraph of my talk, Paul. So absolutely. So as we look at what this means for businesses and for investors to actually understand the impact of their portfolio, every portfolio has an impact. We just don't necessarily know what that is, and it's just not necessarily intentional. It's mostly bad, and there will be some good in it. What we need to actually understand is what is that full impact so that we can start to direct that capital towards the businesses that are part of the solution and not part of the problem. So to your question, Paul, absolutely, that plays into the last mile and to the developing markets. Firstly, we need to help all of those developing markets to, if you like, to jump the curve, right? To get straight to the front line of building businesses that are truly sustainable. Don't do what everybody else has done, which is build unsustainable businesses and then have to radically transform them to become sustainable. But start by showing them that that's exactly how and where they need to get to. And then secondly, through the global supply chains, which are ultimately responsible for so much of that degradation and hardship at the last mile. To be able to show them exactly where their goods, their inputs and everything else are coming from, and to be driving towards this concept of a future fit society where we're no longer celebrating success because we've outsourced all of those externalities down the chains, but quite the opposite. That actually the supply chains we're using are genuinely restorative, are generally rebuilding and empowering those communities at the bottom of the supply chains and in the last mile. And that is where our investment capital, that is where our spend is going, so that we know we're actually reinforcing and rebuilding those communities rather than degrading them through our actions. And ultimately, all businesses flourish because of that, not in spite of that.
Martin Rich, you have saved the reputation of the investment banking industry as Professor Watchman challenged us. But look, here we go. We're ending panel one. There's great complexity. And Martin, thank you for your comments. In fact, thank you to all of you. There's complexity. We need culture change. We're not financing the SDGs. I feel we need to reimagine capital and finance. And that requires culture change, systems change. There's different jurisdictions, there's different contexts. It is a complex thing. What we would hope to deliver out of this is really actionable, clear recommendations that we can collaborate on. One point, there's a gentleman watching called John Franzen, who's got a collaborative platform that he's told us about on the chat function. Let's investigate that after this event. We're not going to have the time to do as much Q&A as we wished with participants. That's just part of the reality. But my commitment to you as moderator is any questions asked on chat, I will task speakers. We'll get the answers, we'll collect them, and we'll put them back out to you. So forgive the lack of interaction, but that's what it is. John, let's look at your platform, see how we deal with that. Thank you, speakers. I'm over to Ingo Kumik in Melbourne with wonderful art behind him. Ingo, the floor is yours for 4.5 minutes, and then we're bang on time. And that would give me great joy. So Ingo, what have you heard from the panel?
Cheers, Paul, and thanks for the 4.5 minutes. I have 28 minutes worth of notes here. In order to keep this nice and succinct, I'm going to move through this in a bit of a sequential fashion, and I'm going to parrot some of the main points that I've heard. So we kicked off with the framing of the challenge, and critically, the impact that COVID has had in exacerbating the systemic problems that initially gave rise to the SDGs in the first place. Compounding this challenge, we also heard that countries most in need are not failing to attract the investment they require. And one of the challenges there comes down to the institutional approaches they take with respect to investment strategies, and especially those that embed SDGs. We heard, and this is a continuing theme, the critical nature of partnerships. So we were very, I think we're all very clear that given the systemic nature of the challenges that we have, no one entity has the agency to deal with this on its own. And so therefore, there are a lot of actors that are required to help drive this. Some of the key areas critically are in capability and capacity building to help in the area of sustainability monitoring and reporting, with a view to understanding the impact of ESG expectations on business. We heard that it's critical to harmonise and standardise that reporting. We also heard quite critically through the idea of the CFO that the companies will be judged not so much on financial value, but more broadly on shared value, social value, environmental, economic value. So again, sort of broader value creation. Professor Watchman asked us whether or not lawyers have a moral compass. I don't think that question was answered. We may need an entirely new session to answer that. I was also at COP6, and it doesn't seem like 20 years ago. We heard that innovation critically is missing in the discussions about SDGs and investment, and quite crucially in the idea of investing in entrepreneurship and innovation, especially in last mile communities. We heard that significantly, and perhaps most significantly, that there are massive investment shortfalls in achieving the SDGs, and to cap the both speaker and panel session off, we heard that focusing on innovating global supply chains and aligning them to investment chains is critical, so that we begin to prioritise human and planetary health. I should also say about supply chains, and perhaps this is a little bit of bias from my point of view, we often talk about them from the point of view of abstract logistics. Supply chains have a material presence, and it looks like people, it looks like families, it looks like communities. These things are about jobs, they're broadly about social mobility. And so in that sense, supply chains are fundamental to place. So I'll leave that there, Paul.
Let me unmute. Ingo, wonderful job. Thank you to all the session one panelists, the opening commentators. We've come to that juncture and we're going to move on. Again, I'd ask you to take away, whether you're a speaker or a participant or a respondent, we're taking these thoughts. They will help us reform the Waterberg Declaration I've referred to. So it is participatory. Ingo, if we can have your 28 pages of notes, that would be a great advantage to us. Again, it's pushing down. One thought, one of the draft recommendations we have is, why don't we take the $100 trillion committed to the UN-backed principles for responsible investment and explore how 0.5% of that, through new approaches, through new products, through new structures, through new funds, might be in some way, shape or form directed on a commercial basis or a social value basis to the base of the pyramid, entrepreneurs and communities. There's a thought. Let's come back to it. I'm finishing panel one. Thank you to you all. Moving now on to panel two, and I hope we're 3 minutes behind as it stands, so I'm happy with that. But I'd like to invite Matt Winneray, who's the CEO of the New Zealand Super Fund, which is led unbelievably well over the last few years and longer on climate change, on social issues, and has also, as I understand it, we've been one of the top sovereign wealth fund performers. And so, Matt, it's great to have you on board. Beautiful background. It reminds me of Lord of the Rings, and the floor is yours for 6 to 7 minutes. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Paul, and kia ora koutou katoa. I am both a reformed lawyer and a reformed banker, so I guess having found no compass in either of those, I'm having a third crack at it. So for the last couple of years, I have been co-chairing the New Zealand Sustainable Finance Forum, which, like a number of these sustainable finance initiatives around the world, we certainly benefited from the work that had been done in the UK, the European one, the Canadian one, and we were doing our work in parallel with the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative. And so a couple of years back, we started work on that, and the idea was to, the objective is a financial system that is more inclusive, more resilient, more agile, more robust. And it's all of those things because it properly incorporates environmental, social, and economic considerations, the long-term impacts of these things into the financial decisions that are being made. And what was interesting was we focused quite a bit in that first report that we produced for that, which was now a little over a year ago, on what we described as the difference between the impact of business and the impact on business. And that's exactly what Professor Mervyn King was talking about in his comments earlier. And so that really resonated. So what we said is you've got to move on from that early sort of form of responsible investment, which is really to think about what's the impact of these things on our business, and start saying, well, what's the impact of our business decisions on these long-term societal trends? And so we produced a report back in the end of 2019, which laid out what we thought was getting in the way. What's stopping our financial system from being sustainable and doing all of these things and incorporating these longer term trends and social outcomes into the decisions that are being made, and laid out a few ideas for how we might go about changing those. And we organized them under a few themes. We called them changing mindsets, greening finance, and financing green. And we stole those last two pretty much unashamedly from the UK Green Finance Strategy report. And then we started a long consultation and discussion process with market participants. Well, about 12 months later, we released at the end of last year, into 2020, our roadmap for change. And something had happened in the meantime. Obviously, the urgent crisis of the pandemic had collided with the existential crisis of climate change. And that had meant that our conversation had changed, that the S, that really poor cousin out of ESG, I think Archana mentioned it before, the S took much greater prominence. Suddenly we were having discussions about resilience. And we're having discussions about resilience because it doesn't much matter what the long term looks like if you can't survive the short term. And so suddenly you're having these really basic conversations. I was with peer investors, and particularly in the States, about what are the sick leave provisions for companies. Because if you don't have paid sick leave, then you're forcing people to go to work, and suddenly you've undermined the resilience of the whole company for the saving of 5 or 10 days of paid sick leave a year. And it was really interesting how we'd moved from that green focus, the critical centrality of the climate change risk, to S. And that's really, S is harder. S is there's more. There's harder proof around causation. There's more difficult metrics. It's harder to produce frameworks for these things, and it's harder to get agreement on what the priorities are. And so what we had a lot of discussions around, well, how do we think about this in terms of treatment of employees, treatment of customers, social licenses, and we started to see that play out in real time during the pandemic. We had wage subsidies provided to companies in New Zealand. We had as an investor quite a lot of discussions with companies about whether they should be claiming those wage subsidies, and given that they were all ultimately coming from all of us. And anyway, so what we produced at the end of this consultation, which had moved from, as I say, that green focus to a broader focus, was a roadmap for change. And what that laid out were our ideas for how do you change this. And this ultimately is about changing decisions. This is not about some sort of engineering. It's not an engineering problem. It's not a system. The financial system is not a set of pipes or wires. It's the aggregate of all the decisions. So in order to do it, we have to change how people make decisions. And so we broke that down. I like to sort of describe it in the old murder mystery approach, the old whodunit. You look for the who's got the means, who's got the motive, and who's got the opportunity. So look around the courtroom and find the dodgy looking one, and generally it's the motive. So so you talk about means, things like frameworks and disclosure, and we heard some really good comments from Professor King around the sort of consistent approach to getting consistency across those frameworks and comparability of data. That means the frameworks you use them for, disclosure, those are all things that you have to have. They're necessary, but what makes it sufficient is the motive. So why are people going to make these decisions in a different way? They're going to make them because they have to, from a responsibility perspective. The fiduciary duty is explicit around it. It's clear that the value is there. So you're properly incorporating the cost of these externalities. I love that externality came up. I think it was in Martin's comments. It's just this fancy way of saying other people's problems, right? So how do you change a decision to remove an externality? You extend your boundary. You push out your time frame, or you push your boundaries a little bit further sideways, and suddenly that problem's yours. It's not somebody else's balance sheet problem. It's not somebody else's environmental problem down the road or around the world. And so that motive is the most fundamental. So fiduciary duties, responsibility, governance, purpose, pricing. Those were the big drivers that are the reasons that people will make decisions. So we produced that roadmap after a couple of years, but had a really interesting pivot in the middle of it as a result of the impact of COVID. And we're now into the how do we actually implement these things. So we've got a whole bunch of recommendations, but we've also got an energized new group of people to charge in there and start banging some heads to change the way in which decisions are made. So I don't know whether I'm close to my 6 minutes, but I'm happy to stop there and hand you some back, Paul.
Matt Winry, brilliant as ever. It's good to see your face across the miles. And one observation and one historical footnote. So I mean, the economist Pigou back in the 1930s nailed externalities. So we've almost been pushing our boundaries for 100 years, and there was work done on it before. So the time is up, right? I mean, that's what I'm hearing. But tremendous work from New Zealand Super Fund. The historical footnote is you mentioned the fact that S is harder. You went like that with your hands. S is harder, right? So the historical footnote is when we, before it was ESG, it was GES, and we were playing around with the acronyms in my UN office in 2004, 2005. And the reason we put S in the middle was if you had governance up front and then environment and S, the S would be flicked off the end by investors because it's too difficult. So let's put S in the middle. Environment, we're getting some metrics. Everyone knows governance is important. And that the thinking was no more deep than that. It went from GES to ESG. S in the middle will safeguard it. No one can flick it off. So just
you should be at Saatchi and Saatchi, Paul.
No, they wouldn't employ me. Anyway, there you go. But thank you, Matt, again. And we're going to move on in this wonderful conversation. We've now got definitely one of my favorite investors in the world, John Oliphant, who is the founding partner of Third Way Investment Partners in whether it's Pretoria or Johannesburg, I'm not sure, but wherever you founded it. But John, who used to lead with great gusto and vision the Government Employees Pension Fund of South Africa, which was and is the largest fund by many a mile, and did tremendous sustainability work. So John, over to you. We go from Auckland, I guess, or Christchurch across to Johannesburg. John, the floor is yours for 6 and a bit minutes. Thank you.
No, thank you, Paul. And thanks to Matt and all the other speakers. I think one thing that you've done well, Paul, is to make me speak after a New Zealander. It's always a proud moment, especially when we are the rugby world champions. And sorry to put that in the mix. Paul, I think, what is important, and I've been listening to the various speakers, is that we need to reflect on what I call the economics of coronavirus before we can think of the solutions. Whether you call that COVIDnomics or you call it the inequality virus, I think it's important to understand what the impact has been so that we understand the damage and then we can start building from there. I mean, we know for a fact that the pandemic has led to an increased inequality to almost every country in the world. I mean, the virus has exposed and increased even the existing inequalities of wealth. We know that, and obviously, I would like to say condolences to the families that have really felt the hardship of the virus. More than 2 million people have died globally. Hundreds of people, millions of people have lost their jobs. I mean, in fact, to put that into context, the US unemployment rate as of March 2020, it was 3.5%. And today the unemployment rate is sitting at about 6.7%. So which means, unemployment rate has doubled in the US. In the Euro area, unemployment is sitting at 8.4%, with the youth rate being much higher. Bringing this much closer to home, our unemployment rate is sitting at stubbornly at about 30%. So we've got 30% of people who are looking for job opportunities and currently cannot find jobs. Depending on which definition and looking at the youth, they have been impacted most significantly. So in my view, this virus has actually pushed more people into poverty, while on the other hand, believe it or not, the richest individuals and companies have been thriving, with the stock markets hitting all-time highs in the midst of the pandemic. The world's wealthiest individuals have become richer. Their wealth have increased by 3.9 trillion between March and December 2020. their total wealth now stands at 12 trillion. And these are just few individuals. To put this into context, Africa's GDP, the entire continent with more than 1 billion people, the total GDP of Africa is 2.6 trillion. But yet you've got very few individuals owning 11.9 trillion, or call it 12 trillion. So while billionaires are getting richer, people living in poverty will become even poorer as a result of the coronavirus. And it is estimated that the people living at less than $5 a day will increase by anything between 200 to 500 million. So that's the context. So the question is, what is to be done going forward? And I hope this conference will help us arrive at answers. And I'll try to give maybe two contexts. One is from a government perspective, and then the second one is from an investment world perspective. From a government perspective, I think there's a need for governments to move away from measuring prosperity through GDP growth or GDP per capita. Clearly that measure has not worked. And maybe there must be a more deliberate focus on reducing inequality. And I think talking about the SDGs, it actually helps because it narrows our thinking in terms of the areas that we have to have a direct impact on. And hopefully governments going forward, instead of saying coming out of the pandemic, the IMF says the world GDP will grow by 5%, the US will grow by this. We need to say, what will be the deliberate impact on inequality of all the policies that have been put in place by various governments? The other point that is important, I think the pandemic has somehow indicated that we've got inadequate universal health, not only in Africa, but globally. There's inequality in terms of access to quality healthcare. And in my view, maybe of the numbers of people that have died globally, it will be interesting to see what was their living standard measure, whether this has had a disproportionate impact on the poor, because the richer were able to save their lives. The second element is the inadequate access to education, quality education. I grew up in a township of Tumahole in Paris. The majority of kids in that environment have not received any form of education during the lockdowns because they've got no access to internet. So when school says that you can't go to school, they sit at home and they are not learning. Whereas people here in Gauteng, in Sandton, in the suburbs, they were able to educate their children through access to internet and so on. So for us to be able to move society forward and deal with the issues, we need to ensure that there's a proper tax dispensation to fund universal access to health as well as universal access to education, because education really can be an important instrument. And I'm a living example of that. Coming out of a poor background, making my way through university and getting to where I am. So it was only education that gave me an opportunity to even be here to address this conference. Of course, there's a whole lot of issues that can be discussed about government tax systems, whether it's progressive, it's whether impacting the poor more than the wealthy, whether the wealthy are actually paying their fair share of taxes. I think that's a far broader discussion that we need to have. So that was from a government perspective. Quickly, from an investment perspective, I've got slight differences. I think there are some on the panel that says there's an adequate allocation of capital towards ESG. That has not been my observation. Since I departed from government and now coming into entrepreneurship, I've launched businesses that are purely focused on enhancing the impact on environmental, social, and governance issues. Our clients have actually made it our mandate to ensure that we report on both the returns as well as the impact. And our focus has been predominantly on investments in economic infrastructure, investment in healthcare, investments in education, and so on. And we have managed to mobilize close to about 20 billion rands. You can convert that to dollars. Yes, still growing. I think Professor Mervyn King also made a reference of the FSCA changes requiring that before you make an investment, you effectively have to integrate this environmental, social, and governance issues into your investment decisions. I don't know if I still have time, but I've got a lot to reflect on. But anyway, Paul.
John, could I gently stop you on that very positive note of the allocation of funds is not the problem, and 20 billion rands in the context of the allocation from third way investment partners and some exciting stuff. So John, as ever, thank you for those comments. I'm now going to pass, and look, one of the joys of this process really has been to get to know and learn of and understand the work of the Tony Elumelu Foundation based in Nigeria. So it's with absolute pleasure, and I really mean that. I think you're supporting more than 10,000 entrepreneurs across Africa. So it's my pleasure to introduce the CEO of the Tony Elumelu Foundation. That's Ifinwe Ugochukwu. I hope I'm close, Ifinwe, but it's a delight to have you on board. Thank you, Lagos. And John Oliphant, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and you did very well. And let me start by thanking the organizers of today's event, UNCTAD in conjunction with Blended Capital Group. It's been an insightful session. I didn't think I would find it as engaging. I thought, okay, I'll just come in when it's time to talk, but I came in at 9 and I've been on since. Really, really great discussion, and so much coming out of it. Our topic today is arguably on everyone's mind daily at all levels of government and private sector. You know, we're thinking, how can we overcome this pandemic and leverage the learnings to build a healthier, more sustainable and prosperous future for ourselves and our children? The pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. So says Professor Klaus Schwab, who is the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. The reset must absolutely usher in the reorganization of communities across the globe with an emphasis on safety, sustainability, and self-reliance. Yes, we are in an era of globalization, but we need to create interconnected but independent communities that are resilient and can bounce back quickly from the catastrophes like the one we've just experienced. Businesses have taken a pounding through this period, and Africa has been said to be the epicenter of the economic impact of the pandemic. But within every challenge lies immense opportunity, and that is the mindset we teach our entrepreneurs. We help them to see that indeed, it is always a good thing when business as usual is overthrown in favor of innovation, creativity, and sustainability. At this time, resilience and perseverance is man's best friend. The private sector is arguably the primary driver for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Therefore, now more than ever, it is critical to catalyze the establishment and growth of the small and medium enterprises across all emerging economies. According to a joint survey by the African Union, the UNDP, and AfriLabs, about 95% of African small and medium enterprises have not received any government stimulus packages whatsoever, in contrast to their counterparts in Europe and the US. This therefore highlights the huge role the private sector, development organizations, and philanthropies, such as our foundation, the Tony Elumelu Foundation, plays in Africa at this time. Creative and innovative financing is truly the order of the day, as we no longer depend on traditional finance institutions to bridge the liquidity gap faced by SMEs in the wake of the pandemic. They have neither the agility nor the bandwidth and reach. So now is the time that we must leverage the reach and versatility of blended finance models, mobile money, even cryptocurrencies, in order to reach the unbanked in all corners of Africa and other emerging markets, and to ensure that there is no one left behind. Financial inclusivity is best achieved through a deliberate and collaborative approach that brings together the entire entrepreneurship ecosystem, recognizing that entrepreneurs at the bottom of the pyramid are as important as the unicorns and the more established SMEs. I was reminded recently, one of these virtual events that I attended, that ever since Bill Gates created Microsoft, he has actually not come up with anything quite so fancy, nor has Mike Zuckerberg invented anything even close to Facebook. Yes, they're buying a lot, but nothing quite as dramatic since they invented those wonderful products in their youth. This tells us that the gold mine rests in the minds and hearts of our youth. And our focus must be youth entrepreneurship empowerment in order to harness our human capital development for maximum impact. At the Tony Elumelu Foundation, we have witnessed firsthand the genius and innovation that sits with young entrepreneurs. We have a commitment launched in 2015 by our founder from his family wealth to invest $100 million to train, mentor, and fund 10,000 African entrepreneurs over 10 years. To date, we've trained and funded just over 9,000 across all 54 African countries, each receiving capacity building and training, mentoring, as well as a non-returnable seed capital of $5,000 each. Our model is giving many entrepreneurs a foot in the door, an opportunity to start their journey. This opportunity they may never have had, given the economic climate of Africa. One example is an entrepreneur called Godwin. He's part of our 2017 cohort. His company is called Tutoria, an online tutoring agency providing employment and much needed income to over 25,000 registered teachers. This is an example of how technology and innovation can turn challenges into an opportunity to create jobs and revenue, as well as giving economic hope at a time when it's much needed. Because Tutoria came at exactly the right time. With the disruption that the pandemic brought to schooling for most children, with parents opting to keep their kids at home and teachers losing their jobs, they now have options, and Tutoria has increased its revenue exponentially in the millions of dollars. But practically, how can we cater to entrepreneurs like Godwin? How can we make sure that they have the capital, the capacity building, and the enabling environment to turn their ideas into reality, to become job creators and not job seekers, to be ready to meet the challenges like the one that Godwin just met? The Tony Elumelu Foundation Entrepreneurship Program speaks to all of this through our training, our mentoring, our funding, and our advocacy. But if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so it is only through collaboration, and that has been echoed by all the speakers today, can we reach and meet our SDGs by 2030. Our blended finance model is quite simple. What we do is that we de-risk the startups and the greenhorns by providing grant funding at a time when they are completely unattractive and not worth the effort for organizations that offer debt or equity financing. So once these entrepreneurs have proven themselves, we then create linkages to these same organizations through our network of angel investors, incubators, accelerators, banks, and VCs. Only after this point can we then begin to identify the unicorns who will go on to become the Bill Gates and the Mark Zuckerbergs of Africa. And so in order to avoid recycling the same entrepreneurs and not ensuring that the opportunity trickles down, we need to begin to work at the bottom of the pyramid and have a blended finance approach to the work that we do. Africa and many emerging economies is full of latent potential, but we must collectively till the soil, water the seed, and create the conditions that will accelerate the growth of SMEs, who will be the drivers of the Sustainable Development Goals and usher in a world of shared prosperity, human dignity, and mutual value creation.
Ifenewa.
So I'll stop there. Oh, I'm mindful of the time.
Not at all. Wonderful, and it was as though I was hearing the Waterberg Declaration. I mean, fantastic, and that's exactly what this conference has been about. Before we go to the very patient Izumi-san in Tokyo and Phil Riddell, I think in a small village in France, although with one foot in Cairo, 20 seconds for myself, just to reiterate what you've said. So for the past 4 years, I've had the pleasure and honor to chair the international board of an organization called SOS Sahel, working from Senegal to Djibouti. The number of Godwins that I met, one in particular, Mohammed in Senegal, who'd done the trip north across the Mediterranean, came back, brilliant, dynamic, starved of capital and a bit of input. But the potential, the demographic bounce of Africa, if we don't capture that, the world will not deliver the SDGs. So again, if an Ewa, really appreciate your comments. That a lovely segue. Azumi-san, I'm coming to you next, and Phil Riddell, thank you for your patience. The wheels are down. I can see the runway, but we're not quite there. So Azumi-san of Oriental Consultants Global, who's been one of the great backers of this process and a very generous supporter going through over the past 8 months. Izumi-san, the floor is yours from Tokyo, and thank you for staying with us.
Thank you, Mr. Paul Clements Hunt, for introduction, and thank you for joining me for this conference today. I understand the main theme for today is rebuilding SDG-aligned business and investment. Particularly some of the sort of jargons coming in for this conference with innovation, entrepreneurship, SDGs, and blended finance to the last. But of course, how to cope with emerging opportunities offered by digital innovation. This is another theme that we need to deal with. How can we serve the poorest communities worldwide? So talking about, let me talk about, I would touch on first about African development countries, for instance, finally, how intervention can be done for infrastructure. In fact, OC Global, I think, thanks to Mr. Paul Clements, is one of the major companies for consulting firms for the infrastructure, mainly focusing on infrastructure development. But personally, I started my career together with some of the others. I've started my career as a banker, mainly for investment banker in Japan, and then I moved to a few multinational development banks. And then since the last 20 years, I've been serving mainly for the African and Asian countries. So for rebuilding the back to the SDGs, this is a key question today. And talking about the African where the sort of OC Global operates and the infrastructure, how the UN SDG on infrastructure, how can we mobilize capital and financing to emerging opportunities or very keen opportunities? Let's say, starting with reviewing the Sustainable Development Goal number 9, it says, build resilient infrastructure to develop quality, reliable, sustainable, and resilient infrastructure. If I can repeat, due to the precious time, but the quality, reliable, sustainable, and resilient infrastructure, how can we deal with? Of course, we understand the investment gap in globally, it's amounted to more than US dollar to 15 trillion US dollars. And Africa represents about 9% or 6% or so. But the large-scale infrastructure so far, such as transportation, roads, ports, airports, they have a very acute demand in developing countries. But large-scale projects often adopt so-called public-private partnership. PPP is one of the jargon that we have been accustomed to use due to the public debt issues in developing countries. So the public finance cannot sort of afford to support those new infrastructure development. So there are many projects, however, we've been very much concerned about them. It has been criticized that the infrastructure in question is supposed to last about 40 years, but in reality, it turned out to be scrapped, sorry to say, but after 10 years, due to its poor quality. So how can we improve the quality? So we'd like to then also beneficial to consider a quality infrastructure for SDG Goal 9. I would say one thematic approach is the life cycle cost procurement. So actually, life cycle cost procurement principle is not applied to new infrastructure investment, but may cost less expensive if it's not applied. But it may be followed by substantial expenses for operational maintenance if it is not applied. Then the value of the whole life of the infrastructure may cost higher. But if you can ensure the good life cycle cost principles, i.e. the initial investment may cost higher, but the maintenance cost is lower, then lifetime costs may be lower at the end. That will be beneficial for not only for those investors, but also the people in question. So this is the first thing. Then we will move by utilizing the remaining 3 minutes or so. But I'd like to touch on very quickly 2 short stories. The first one from Japan, talking about the issues, how the business community in Japan, talking about, which are also introduced and spreading around the mouth of the notion of what we call communication, which is a word made from English, called, as you may know, communication. But you can replace C with N, then you can pronounce it communication. It's a kind of social gathering after work with the people, after just a long work, but you have some time to socializing. Quite often we are using now so-called Uber service for eating services. Eating service, which they call it Uber Eats. Now they're operating in more than 15 countries. In Japan, about 10 cities are there operating, having a very speedy services. Sometimes people want to continue discussion after the work, but each one goes back home before we can drop by a bar or a cafe or something to enjoy a drink and also talk. But now we need to place an order. But thanks to digital innovation, the people can place the order to Uber Eats, and then 20 minutes it's delivered at their doorsteps at home, and they can enjoy while drinking, but also seriously and friendly talk each other. This is a way how you can also, I would say, available in also other countries. Now move on to the second question about second story about is a case in Mozambique. In fact, jatropha oil, I think as you may know, as one of the biofuels, a jatropha oil producing company was established in 2012 by a Japanese oil machinery company. Then distributing biofuel to northern regions in the college, to the villages, people having no access to electricity. So primarily, they also enjoy the people, the biofuel supply, and then using for the purpose of the electricity generation. There's also they hope open the kiosks to provide electrical services such as refrigerators, putting some refrigerators, ice cube box makers, lanterns. I think, as you know, they're both small lanterns, and they're changing the tools for the smartphone, charging tools for smartphones. These are the things. So in shop, starting with sort of supplying for this, in the end, they have started to ask, villagers asked to bring their sort of issues, bring their products as a result of the work. So then they have also, in fact, the Japanese firms started to operate in a sense of the financial services by taking into sort of financial cash service and also the using credit and account. And now FAO and the World Bank have joined their programs. So this one, which I call it in short, sorry, I missed or talk too much, but they are serving for many sort of SDG goals, such as no poverty, 0 SDG 2, zero hunger, and also the particular partnerships. What I would like to stress here for this exactly activity is not only PPP, public-private people's partnership. I rather call it 4 Ps, public-private people's partnership. That has been creating and uniting people in collaboration. Thank you. This is my network presentation. Thank you.
Izumi-san, thank you. Insightful, colorful. I love the digital connectivity in terms of, I guess, Japanese business people having the food delivered at exactly the same moment at home, so they can then come together and drink and talk and collaborate and build trust and continue those things. So Izumi-san, thank you very much indeed. And as we head towards, what I'm going to do is, with the UN's willingness and also understanding some people will have to leave on the hour, I think let's be comfortable. We'll let it run over just a few minutes, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. And in that way we can finish, despite our best efforts at timekeeping. I think we've done well. We can finish in a comfortable way. So we're going to go to Phil Riddell. And Phil, who is currently spends a good amount of his time in Cairo, works on water and water resource policy and sector investment specialist. And Phil, without overstating it, I think your job is one of the most important, because I know you have real insight into partnerships in the water sector where private business, public government come together to deliver infrastructure which delivers at scale over many decades. It might not be the most aggressive return in the world, but it works and it delivers to people and communities on the ground. So Phil, the floor is yours. Then we'll go to Ingo Kumak, for a little response, then we'll close. Phil Riddell, thank you for being so patient. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks to all the conveners for this comprehensive and very necessary conversation. I'm greatly encouraged by the convergence of concerns and interests. They certainly converge with some of mine. Just for the record, I occupy an EU-funded position, which my terms of reference describe as Special Advisor to the Minister of Water and team leader of a 4.6 million sector reform project. And I'm currently greeting you from Cairo right now. Egypt has a large, important, and by some measures very successful agriculture sector covering around 3.6 million hectares, almost all of which is irrigated. The country would like to increase this area by a little over 20% to 4.4 million, but because its available water resources are extremely limited and increasingly needed by other sectors, it wants to achieve this increase in irrigated area without increasing the amount of water involved. It also wants to increase the total amount of water available through groundwater recycling and desalination, so that the percentage of the total supply for agriculture has reduced by about 10% by 2030. This requires an increase in a metric known as physical water use efficiency, which is achieved by the uptake of modern irrigation technology that has become generically known as drip, although a range of technologies are available. It also requires that the canals and pipes that supply the farm shift to continuous flow supply through rehabilitated and upgraded distribution infrastructure. In order to get where the government wants to be, a budget of approximately 25 billion euros has been made available to the Ministry of Water Resources and Irrigation by the Ministry of Finance. This will operate effectively as a basket-financed adaptable program facility, while relieving the line ministry of the need to deal with multiple donors and their multiple agendas, milestones, and reporting requirements. And for a sector finance specialist such as myself, this is a great mezzanine result. But for now, I want to concentrate on the farm level, about which my sector finance team and I noted that promotion of DRIP as a public sector project has not worked, even with grants and subsidies. It was promoted only on the basis of water savings, but many of the farmers targeted are not water insecure and do not want to indebt themselves in order to solve problems that they perceive as being government's, not theirs. But even where DRIP projects fail, and they sometimes do, not least because of Jevons paradox, and where they fail to meet the objectives of their intended beneficiaries, there are always other beneficiaries, and these are usually not factored into the calculus, but these other beneficiaries almost always win. They're the retailers, the manufacturers, and the financial service providers along the equipment supply chain. So we asked ourselves, why don't we rethink DRIP not as a project, but as a market, and let the supply chain promote the products, leaving government to regulate the quality of the equipment and its use. This idea seems to have settled well, both with the government and with the EU. And in a moment, I'll explain how we've been asked to implement it. But first, we need to establish some key perspectives. Government has promoted DRIP only with respect to its water saving benefits, but the literature and experience identify 15 other benefits, all of which have the potential of raising even a water secure farmer's financial efficiency, which is the only efficiency he or she is worried about. Also, Egypt's DRIP project grants and subsidies economic internal rate of return has been predicated on the wrong benefits, which were increased agricultural gross margins, and ignores too many externalities. So we're back to externalities again. In fact, the same benefits could be achieved without DRIP if all the externalities lean in the same direction. We've suggested that a grant and subsidy program is largely justified on the economic value of the water that is made available by the increase in efficiency, and which can be allocated in a direction that reduces its opportunity cost. And these opportunities reside in the potable water sector, the sanitation sector, industrial sector, navigation sector, and the environment sector. But also promoting DRIP as a public project involves unnecessary transaction costs and introduces a risk that technology prescriptions will be biased towards products that government wishes to promote, rather than a technological neutral approach that would characterize a market. Furthermore, we've suggested successfully that the grants and subsidies are provided not to the farmers, but to the financial service providers via blended instruments. Based on all this, we're undertaking an economic analysis of a grant and subsidy program that is based not only on increased agricultural productivity of water, but also, and most importantly, the economic value of the water that's reallocated. At the same time, we're undertaking a financial analysis at farm level of drip-based farming systems to confirm affordability. And this is where the externalities I've mentioned above are going to be covered by a sensitivity analysis. And then invited by the EU, we're designing a pilot blending fund of 100 million euros ready for submission to the EBRD later this quarter. It's intended to position the drip market as a new business within a normal and thriving overall FSP portfolio. But the FSPs which currently perceive this new business as high risk, it isn't. There's countless case studies that confirm otherwise. So in parallel, we're developing the financial business case to support the affordability conjecture. But there is nonetheless a need for blended finance to do this, to raise the FSP's comfort levels for the time being. And in closing, we're evaluating 4 transaction models, which is capital grants for on-lending subject to lower interest rates. This is a tricky one because when this has been tried, particularly in Eastern Europe, the banks have sat on the money to lever up their lending rates. The second one is a leverage loan indemnity where we put money on account and take the first percentage of risk. The third is a simple revenue risk guarantee. And what I think is the most interesting is any combination of those, but with the FSP's financing devolved to the retailers in order to reduce transaction costs at the FSP level. Paul, that's it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And you go right to the nub of it. I mean, it would be great if you don't mind sharing your notes, because I would love to trickle some of that into the things that we'll build on top of the declaration. And it is that idea of new models reimagined. It doesn't have to be just government or private. It's that common space. And I think, you know, some of the analytical work and the technical work that you're rolling out has many implications for other sectors. So again, closing panel 2, thank you all. Ingo, I'm giving you the impossible job of come from 100,000 feet and the flavor, the feeling from the overall conversation, not necessarily panel 2. Take a few minutes there and then we'll go across to Professor Watchman and Judge Professor King to close. So Ingo, thank you for being the time flexible component in this, and hope to make it up to you someday with a beer in Melbourne. So Ingo, over to you.
Thanks very much, Paul. I was just reflecting very quickly on the similarities between the artwork behind me and that behind Professor King. Clearly the same artist at work. I am going to cut to the chase. What I've tried to do, I've tried to synthesize what's been said across both panels. And I've tried to synthesize them into critical drivers or enablers of the change that we are seeking or need. There are 6 of them, so I'll go through them very quickly. One is fit for purpose and agile capital and finance. So we're looking for new mechanisms and funds that allow us to liberate rather than burden. And these things, for example, some exist. So we have the UN Joint Sustainable Development Goal Fund. Anne-Marie Connor a couple of days ago spoke about the need for a bigger bond market, more fit for purpose bonds. We need new debt financing models, again, that help and liberate rather than burden. The second driver concerns governance and ESG. Critically to align decision-making about supply and investment chains to ensure flow of capital demonstrates both legal and moral integrity, and in turn ensures business leads the creation of local economies that prioritise social mobility and planetary health. So a little one there. The third driver concerns enterprise and entrepreneurialism. So we need to move from a project delivery mindset to an enterprise development one in order to sustain the investment and development of aggregated impacts and scalable, replicable solutions. And our a few speakers in panel 2 couldn't agree more, particular emphasis on youth entrepreneurship, especially in developing economies. The fourth driver are place-based impacts, so localising the SDGs. So the impact that we seek to make, we make on real communities and real economies. And there's a particular importance in enabling impacts in and for communities in developing economies or those vulnerable communities in developed economies. So I've spent a number of years, close to 3 decades, working in a number of cities that you know, you would argue have healthy economies, but there is always the downside. The fifth one is perhaps closest to my heart as a recently appointed director of the Partnership Brokers Association in London. The fifth one is partnerships, or SDG 17. And again, everyone's spoken about them. I do note that in a previous forum, Izumi-san did mention the concept of communication, which again, I thought was a cracking concept, but I'll let him explain that one day. And the sixth driver concerns advocacy and capacity building. So creating the right conditions is critical. And things like the UNCTAD World Investment Forum is pivotal to mobilising capital, finance and cooperation in order to liberate economies and social potential. So they're the 6 sort of key drivers and themes that I picked up on.
Ingo, I would pay a pretty price for your notes. So thank you very much for that wonderful synthesis. Also, I mean, what I can project back to last May and right through till now is the alignment of the themes and the conversations from willing, positive, purposeful people. It's just across the boundary. We're trying to capture that in the Waterberg Declaration. So certainly today's conversation here will be poured into that. And Ingo, that was extremely helpful. It goes without saying, I'm going to pass over to, apologies for the overrun. We've had a rich and full session. I'll say my thank yous now. Thank you to UNCTAD, to Dr. Zahn, Anthony Miller. Thanks all to OSU Global again for your generosity around this process over the last year. And genuine thanks to all the speakers, particularly Professor Watchman and Judge Professor King, who have anchored and driven this process relentlessly. So Professor Watchman, brief closing comments, and then Judge Professor King to close. And I should remind you, this will be continued for another 2 hours, going west when we look to Brazil, the US, again, parts of Africa, and then we finish the process this evening. So Paul, the floor is yours. Paul?
Sorry, thank you very much, Paul. Some fantastic presentations from the speakers and a lot of food for thought. I'm just going to, I think, in the time allotted to me, just look at some of the key concepts that came out of this. I think every speaker emphasized the need for interconnectivity, interdependence, interlinking, integrity, and intergenerational. And those things are very important when we look at things like blended capital, risk tolerance, what's fit for purpose, and building back. It's almost like the Three Musketeers, isn't it? You know, we've realized that it's all for one or one for all, that if we're going to have a way of pushing forward during this period post-pandemic, we're going to have to find a way of not only providing social justice, but providing the financial means for countries throughout the world to develop in a positive way. And I think one of the things that was linked very well by one of your speakers was the importance of education. Education, housing, the use of various financial mechanisms from the public sector and the private sector to get there. I was also impressed with our alphabet soup. It seems even thicker on acronyms than it has been in the past. We've got ESG, SDG, supply chain, value chain, and human rights, DD. And we probably LOL, but I'm not quite sure what that stands for. The emphasis on employees, I think, has become very, very evident, or the need to emphasize the rights of employees during the pandemic has become a glaring problem and something that needs to be addressed, as indeed is social housing. Because without shelter, without proper housing, people are going to be living and working in unsanitary conditions. So Just to sum up my view about the base of the pyramids and to answer my question, do corporate lawyers have a moral compass? Well, William Shakespeare many years ago wrote one of his characters, Dick the Butcher, who said, the first thing we do is kill all the lawyers. I'm hoping we don't have to go that far and maybe leave one or two who are appropriately orientated, like Judge King. Thank you very much.
Well, Watchman, thank you very much indeed. Judge Professor Mervyn King, to close, and I'll take 30 seconds at the very end on next steps. So Judge Professor King, closing comments. Thank you again, Paul. Mervyn. Mervyn? I think you're on mute, Mervyn.
Not anymore.
Good. Excellent.
We've been talking a lot about the E and the S, but nothing about the G. And the G, of course, is critical in achieving the E and the S, and that's quality governance and not quantitative governance. Unfortunately, since the late 80s with Adrian Cadbury, governance became a mindless checklist issue. And so you would say you've got a nominations committee, you've got a preponderance of non-executive directors, et cetera, you tick those boxes and conclude you're practicing good governance. Of course, it did not follow. Then we had the IRC with outcomes-based corporate reporting. Followed, that was December 13. By September 15, we had the outcomes-based social outcomes of the 16 SDGs, 17 being collaboration, as we've discussed. So by 2016 and 17, I was asking the question, if reporting and thinking to achieve a sustainable development was based on outcomes, shouldn't governance be outcomes-based? And I tested this around the world at the various universities that I was lecturing at and teaching at. And one of the main ones, just by the way, the two Melbourneians, Tara and Matt, there's a school on all this at Deakin University in Melbourne, headed by John Stanhope and Michael Bray. And I happen to be the advisor there in Melbourne, if and when I can get back to Melbourne. But I started asking the question, shouldn't governance be outcomes-based? And the conclusion was that it should be. And it should be mindful outcomes, not this mindless checklist, which was becoming almost a grudge compliance and not adding value to the business judgment calls of the collective mind of the board. We came to the conclusion there were 4 critical outcomes which stakeholders saw any organization or company achieving these 4 outcomes. They would conclude as a rational conclusion that this organization is practicing quality governance. And these are they. Number 1, value creation in a sustainable manner. 2, ethical culture with effective leadership, meaning an acceptance by the leaders that the organization they were acting for, like a company limited liability, was incapacitated, artificial, has no heart, mind, or soul, or conscience, that the conscience of the company is their conscience. When something goes wrong, they are to blame, not society's wrath on the company, who, being incapacitated, is actually innocent at all times. The third thing is adequate and effective controls internally, that the oil, in automotive terms, the oil is there running the engine, the activities to achieve the outcome of producing the product, which other outputs such as waste, etc. And the fourth issue was trust and confidence by the community in that company, in the area in which it operated, with legitimacy of operations. Now, in making business judgment calls, a board can mindfully apply its mind to the business judgment call it's about to make and ask, what impact is it going to have on any one or all or 4 of these major outcomes for a qualitative governance issue? And if they're going to have an adverse impact, think again before making that business judgment call. And in doing so, you start adding to the achievement by the company of its business model, which had a pertinent SDGs pertinent to the business of the company embedded into it, and its strategy, where there were adverse impacts, strategy how to eradicate and ameliorate it, because then you would be meeting the one outcome of value creation in a sustainable manner. So I conclude by saying that yes, environment, yes, sustainability, absolutely critical. As you know, Paul, I for years have been advocating that, but it's got to be engineered, it's got to be conducted with qualitative governance, and it's got to be mindful and outcomes-based. Thank you.
Mervyn, with real thanks. And just to all of you at a human level, I would hope these conversations and what results and the fact that you've been committed and brought your experience to the table are genuinely seen as a gesture of condolence and respect to the millions of families who've lost people, the people who've fallen ill in every different respect. So for all its imperfections, for all the bumps of the conversation, what I feel is nothing but positive energy. I think we'll play that into the Waterberg Declaration, and with respect to the people who live in Waterberg and the communities. But again, a gesture of condolence and respect, but a commitment to powerful action in the future to change the way the system works, to leave nobody behind, in the words of the UN. And to close, great thanks to Dr. James Zan at UNCTAD and Anthony Miller and the team there. And we will continue this afternoon. But on behalf of us all, whether it's UNCTAD or any of the speakers, great job. I enjoyed it. I hope you did. Fantastic. Let's move this to action, and we continue this afternoon. We will keep you involved, and please get involved in helping us to frame and shape the Waterberg Declaration as we put it to bed over the next 2 months, launch it, get signatories, and take it on to Dr. Zan's World Investment Forum in Abu Dhabi, hopefully in October. Good luck. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks for the excellent session.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Not at all, James. A real pleasure. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day. See some of you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Bye now.
See ya.